So now the next plant hormone that we want to focus on is actually my favorite, and it's ethylene gas. And so this is going to actually be a gas. It's in the gaseous state, even in the plant when it acts as a hormone. That's going to have many different effects that are going to be very important to the overall health and success of the plant. Now, the one that I find most interesting is this following effect. Ethylene gas is what causes the triple response to mechanical stress. So let's write this down as the triple response. That's a physiological response to our stimulus, which would be mechanical stress. Now, what do I mean by this? So what you have to imagine is the following scenario. This is going to simply be a maneuver that's going to allow, so it's going to be a specific movement that's going to allow the plant to avoid a physical obstacle that's in its way. So a physical obstacle. So what you imagine is the following. You have a seed and it's growing as per normal underground, and it's about to shoot up out of the soil. But what's blocking it is this big rock. And that rock is not going to be moved no matter how strong that seed grows, that shoot structure, no matter how much division is happening at the apical meristem. And so you have to wonder, how is this seed going to move sort of away from this physical obstacle? And that's what I meant to write here, obstacle. Okay, so how is this seed going to move away from this obstacle? It's going to be through something known as a triple response, and that's initiated by the release of ethylene gas. So let's look at this in terms of a stepwise pattern. What we're going to have is a stimulus. That's how all hormones work. There needs to be a stimulus that triggers their production. And the stimulus is the physical obstacle. From the example that I just gave, it's the rock that's covering the seed that's trying to grow upwards out of the soil. So how is this seed that's trying to grow upwards going to move around, maneuver away from this physical obstacle? Well, once this stimulus is sort of seen and felt by the top of the growing seed, it's going to cause a production of ethylene. So the seed produces ethylene, which is a gas, and once this gas hormone has been produced, you will then get the triple response, which I think is a great name for a very cool process that this seed is going to do. The triple response, which is exemplified in figure 39.12, shows us the following 3 steps in order to avoid mechanical stress and maneuver away from a physical obstacle. They are as follows. First, the triple response will involve a slowing down of the stem elongation, because right now we have a problem. We don't want to continue growing our stem so fast and so strong, so let's slow it down and deal with the problem head on. And now, another part of the triple response, so that's part 1, is the stem will actually thicken. So there will be a stem thickening. Why are we thickening the stem? Why is it growing strong? It's growing in this thickened pattern because this gives us an overall stronger stem. Because right now we have this physical obstacle in our way and we got to somehow maneuver away from it. Let's sort of make sure that we are reinforced very nicely with a strong stem. And I think this is the coolest part, is that the ethylene is actually going to cause this growing stem to produce a curvature. It will actually cause the stem to curve, produce curvature, in a way that the stem is simply going to grow horizontally. Stem grows horizontally. And I think that's crazy to think that this stem that normally, wants to grow straight up actually makes this decision to grow horizontally based off of the production of ethylene, which causes these 3 responses. And in all, once you have these 3 responses occurring and successfully occurring, therefore, once you've essentially avoided the obstacle, so I'll say once avoided, what you do is you stop producing ethylene. So there's less ethylene that will be produced. And so now you will no longer grow horizontally. You will go back to your normal vertical growth. So I'll just write down that as normal vertical growth, because you've avoided the obstacle. And this is why you will see sometimes plants growing out of or out from underneath a rock, where you have a rock structure here, right? And you see a plant that sort of grows like this outwards, and it has this ability to do that because of this ethylene response, a physiological response to ethylene with this triple response mechanism. So I think that's pretty cool. In addition, ethylene gas is also involved in another very important process in plants called senescence. So it's called senescence. Okay, very fancy term here. Senescence is the programmed cell death, and I think this is absolutely fascinating. It's one of the most interesting topics in biology altogether, the idea of programmed cell death. And we'll talk a lot about that when we get to the immune system, which is my favorite. So, programmed cell death. This is going to be the actual manipulated death of certain cells, and that's going to, let's write that down, programmed cell death of certain cells, or sometimes even entire organs, or the whole plant will die. And that's going to be all based off of this keyword here, programmed cell death, because of the release of ethylene. So how does this work? Essentially, when you see things like leaves shedding, right? When you have leaf shedding, that's an example of senescence. When you have the death of an annual plant, right? There are certain plants called annuals that only grow at a certain time of the year and then they die. That death of annuals is because of senescence, which is because of ethylene gas. And also, something that's applicable to us, we learned about vessel elements, right? VEs, what are they at maturity? They're dead at maturity. What causes them to be dead at maturity? What sort of causes this decision to be dead at a point of your life cycle? This is all through programmed cell death called senescence via the release of ethylene gas. Overall, the term for all of this would be via, let's say, the mechanism that causes senescence, that thus utilizes ethylene gas, is called apoptosis, which is unbelievably fascinating to me. The idea that cells will be programmed to kill themselves, essentially. It's cell suicide based off of certain environmental cues that happen. The cue here, the stimulus here, and the response is the ethylene gas. So essentially apoptosis, and this simplifies it greatly, but essentially when you have apoptosis in a plant cell, there's going to be certain enzymes that are going to be transcribed and translated to specifically break down everything, to break down the self, to break down the DNA, the RNA, the chloroplasts. All of the organelles will be broken down by these very powerful enzymes in order for the programmed cell death to happen. This is an important part of a plant life cycle because you need certain things to be dead, or you need the plant to, as a whole, die because it's an annual plant and can only grow successfully at a certain time, or you may need to shed leaves. All in all, this is a part of senescence via programmed cell death. What is the key idea here? It's all because ethylene gas has been released via whatever stimulus caused it to be released. Finally, the last thing about ethylene gas is the idea of fruit ripening. So fruit ripening is very sort of relevant to us because we all enjoy fruits, most of us at least. And so what's going to happen here is that this will occur at the middle lamella, and this is something we briefly went over before in a previous lecture. And at the middle lamella, which is just the region between the cell walls of adjacent cells, so all cells are sort of connected to each other via this middle lamella region, and that's between each cell's cell wall. There's going to be this structure called pectin, right? But what's going to happen when ethylene gas is produced, it causes fruit ripening because it dissolves pectin. Pectin dissolves, and when pectin dissolves, this gives us a nice, soft, and supple fruit, which is what we enjoy when we want a ripe fruit. We don't want a harder fruit. In addition, ethylene gas, in terms of fruit ripening, causes direct color changes of the fruit, which are, at least in terms of the aesthetics, pleasing to us as humans. In addition, fruits are sweet for a specific reason. Fruits aren't always sweet, actually. They have to ripen. When you eat a non-ripe fruit, it's very sort of bitter, right? And it doesn't taste good. That's because at that time, there's actually, the sweetness of it is actually in the form of starches and acids, which don't sound like they taste good, right? But what's going to happen is when ethylene gas causes the fruit ripening process, these starches and acids, which are originally there for the maintenance of the fruit, for the maintenance of the seeds, right? For the seed to be successful and to grow nicely, they're actually going to turn into sugar. And when these starches and acids turn into sugar, guess what? You get a sweet fruit. Sweet and soft fruit is what we want in terms of our human consumption of those fruits. And thus, even us, as not even as just humans, but animals themselves also want sweet and soft fruit because it tastes good, and thus they will aid in the seed dispersal process. That seed dispersal process is governed essentially by ethylene gas. It's a very powerful hormone. That's why I think it's my favorite. In addition, fruit ripening involves a chain reaction, which is a very simple mechanism in terms of how it works. All it means is that when ethylene gas is released, it actually triggers fruit ripening, right? So it triggers, ethylene triggers fruit ripening. And when ethylene triggers fruit ripening, you also get this double sort of movement in which fruit ripening triggers ethylene production. And so you have this extreme sort of positive feedback loop where you have fruit ripening, where ethylene causes fruit ripening, and fruit ripening triggers ethylene production consistently. And this cycle of positive feedback is going to cause a fruit to ripen rather quickly and rather successfully. And finally, in terms of commercial importance, fruit ripening is critical for commercial sort of success of plants. Commercially, you look at tomatoes. A commercial tomato will actually ripen on command. And why is that? Usually what happens is these tomatoes are genetically engineered to not release ethylene on their own. Their transcription for ethylene is stopped. And what happens is farmers are capable of picking these tomatoes when they're green. This is the color change that's about to happen. Put them in a big sort of large container or a large sort of structure and just throw ethylene gas on them. That's going to cause their color to change from green to red. That's going to cause their pectin to dissolve. That's going to cause their starches and acids to turn into a sugar, which gives us a nice true tomato, which is what we want. This prevents a lot of spoilage of tomatoes because tomatoes are known to ripen very quickly. And so when you can manipulate when you want tomatoes to ripen, you can prevent the spoilage of those tomatoes and thus the loss of that fruit as a whole. And this is ethylene gas, my favorite. We'll conclude in the next flowchart with a little bit more hormones that are not part of this sort of large class of hormones that we've covered in the past couple of flowcharts.